However, it now meant that his eldest surviving son would succeed him as Alexander II. He was 37. He was handsome, tall, like all the Romanovs, maybe prematurely aging. He was getting bald in a hurry. But he was better educated than most of his contemporaries. And he was to prove himself an enlightened autocrat. He realized that his family, the Romanovs, and the empire that they represented had to reform or perish. Asthmatic, unhappily married, unfortunately. His wife was Maria von Hesse-Darmstadt, a Prussian princess. She'd borne him 8 children, but they were still, that doesn't require love or affection. And his real love was his mistress, Katerina Dolgorukaya, Princess Dolgoruki. And she had borne him 4 children. So he had quite a little family there. Now, on Coronation Day in 1856, he declared his intention to emancipate the serfs of Russia. This was world-shaking. 217 years, this had been the economic base of Russia. And a few years later, they were liberated without a shot being fired, contrary to another liberation going on the other side of the planet in a sea of blood. Well, of course, for this, he's called the Liberator Tsar. And he instituted a series of reforms. He released the press from its censorship. He built schools for the children in the villages. He took off the restrictions on travel in Russia. He set up Zemstuf, which were sort of like community halls where people would come and tell the bureaucrats what they should do and what was wrong, and generally town hall meeting sort of thing. Very progressive. But when a repressive regime takes the lid off repression, what happens? Everything flares up. Now, the repressed agitators become absolutely manic at this point. And his regime was plagued with anarchists. We call them terrorists today. Socialism was growing much stronger in Europe everywhere since 1848. And in Russia it had been suppressed, and now it came out. This wasn't particularly anarchistic or violent, but it was a part of the movement that generated it. There were 7 attempts to assassinate Alexander. Most of them were led by a group called the People's Will. These were nihilists. They just wanted to bring down the regime. They didn't care who was on top. It was all to come down. That was their view. By the late 60s, 1860s, Alexander was being scared back into reaction. This always happens. When you try to do something nice and you get slapped in the head for it, then you pull back. There was one instance, a huge incident. It took place in February of 1880. Hard to forget this one. It was in the Winter Palace there in St. Petersburg. And I forget the exact occasion, whether it was the Tsar's birthday or whatever it was. All the royals were present, a great occasion, everybody dressed in their jewels and medals, and they were going to have a grand banquet to celebrate the occasion, and they were waiting. One of the aged great aunts, Dowager Princess, I think it was the Emperor's Aunt Xenia, was late getting herself ready, Everybody else had come to the reception room and were waiting. And she was about 15 minutes late. When she arrived, then, of course, the emperor took the empresses, the band struck up the anthem, and they all started for the dining room. Suddenly, there was a terrible explosion. The whole building shook. The lights went out. The candles fell over. The dust and plaster dust filled the air. Women started screaming. The servants rushing about, trying to put out fires. Chandeliers swaying back and forth. It was a mess inside. Well, out across the great plaza in front of the palace at the naval gate, naval arch, you could look across and see. And even in the evening light, you could see a black column of smoke in the center of the building rising. What had happened? Well, what had happened is the terrorists had set a bomb in the room below the dining hall. Now, the room below was the officers' mess, or a lounge for officers. And they managed to put in, I don't know how much dynamite, on a timing fuse. It was going tick, tick, tick. And it was to go off when everybody was seated in the dining room. Well, of course, Aunt Xenia saved them all by being late. The ceiling fell in, the floor collapsed, hundreds of people were injured, several dozen were killed, officers below and servants in the dining room. It was a terrible disaster and very scary. A few days later, the police commissioner came to the emperor and said the police could not protect him any longer unless he submitted to a close guard, which meant guards outside his bathroom, outside his bedroom, in his office, the hallways, everywhere. He couldn't go anywhere. He would be under police guard all the time. And the emperor said, I am not going to live like a prisoner in my own house. If it's God's will that I die, so be it. Well, the police commissioner, in despair, resigned. It was February. No, it was March now. March, oh goodness, how could I forget? March 13th. 1881. Oh, yes. You know, all of the Imperials had to live in a state of constant routine. Everything they did was routinized. There was something you had to do every day and so on. Everybody was expected. You did it. You didn't argue about it. And Sunday was no different. The routine on Sundays was first church, and then the emperor went with his aides to the Michael Riding School to review the cadets. Now, they loved this. They loved to see the emperor, and he loved to go there. He and his brothers had all graduated from the Michael Riding School. So that took until around 1 o'clock. And then they went to one of the palaces in the city, one of his relatives, his brother, his aunt, somebody, for lunch and spend the afternoon. And 4 o'clock sharp, they left wherever that was and went back to the Winter Palace. And this is what Alexander looked forward to. Being with his now second wife. He had married Katerina Dolgorukaya. His wife had died a few months before, his empress, and he now married his mistress. So he looked forward to this evening together. Well, that day went off, routine, the church, the riding school, the luncheon, and at 4 o'clock, he and his aides descended the steps to the carriage park and got in the coaches that would take him back to the Winter Palace. Rushing along toward the palace in the dusk, they did not notice a peasant woman walking along the side of the road. As the emperor's entourage passed quickly, she took something out of her basket, ran into the road, and threw it at Alexander's carriage. It hit the back of the coach and bounced back into the mounted horse guard and exploded. It was a bomb, and of course, mangled horses and screaming troopers were all in a melee. Alexander forced his carriage to stop, and he got out. Well, his aides in the previous coach in front, they immediately stopped, and they ran back, and then tried to induce him to get into his carriage and go on. He said, no, we must help the injured. Of course, the explosion had brought the neighborhood out. Everybody was pouring out of the buildings. Great crowd was collecting around the emperor and the wounded. And then nobody noticed this man working his way through the crowd very quickly in a heavy overcoat, doing something underneath. As he got up to the side of the emperor, he took it out and threw it down at the emperor's feet. It was a second bomb. When the smoke and the snow and screaming stopped, there were dozens of people dead or dying. The emperor lay there, his uniform shredded off, one leg off at the hip, the other one at the knee. He was still conscious, moaning in agony. The aides and attendants that were with him that could still function picked him up and took him to the first carriage and rushed him on to the Winter Palace. But of course, 20 minutes before this, back at the Winter Palace, his wife, Princess Narishkin, was preparing for their evening, getting their dinner ready and the lights and getting everything they were looking forward to. She heard the concussion of the bomb. Everybody heard it. You always heard these things and you always worried, where was that? What was happening? And a few minutes later, in rushed, under her windows, the first coach, all disheveled, the horse guards, some of them without helmets, all shouting, everybody in disarray, rushed past the windows. What had happened? 5 minutes later, one of his aides appeared at her door and told her she fainted. An hour later, the imperial family was gathered in the emperor's bedroom. He was unconscious, dying. Catherine lay across his body weeping. The children were there from both marriages, and anybody else of importance. And an hour later, Alexander expired. He was 63. The bitter irony of all of this is that on his desk, to be signed at a ceremony the following day, was Russia's first constitution. It would not be signed.